October 1944, the Philippine Sea. The air is thick with the stench of burning heavy oil and the salt spray of the Pacific. It is the eve of the largest naval battle in human history, but on the anti-aircraft deck of a U.S. Navy Cleveland-class light cruiser. The world has shrunk down to the view through a single optical sight. A young gunner named John is staring dead ahead, his palms so slick with sweat. A black dot in the clouds is growing larger by the second, accompanied by a sound that grates on the nerves like a dentist's drill. The high-pitched scream of a Japanese Zero fighter in a steep dive. For the sailors of the Allied fleet, that sound has been the death knell for years. Beside John, a loader screams over the roar of the engines, jamming a 55-pound, 5-inch shell into the breech. Up until this precise second, anti-aircraft warfare was essentially a math problem that could not be solved on a battlefield. To hit a plane diving at 300 miles per hour while corkscrewing through the air, a gunner had to guess where the plane would be. You had to estimate where the plane would be in 5 seconds, physically crank a dial on the shell to set a timer fuse for exactly 5 seconds. If you were off by 1/10 of a second, the shell would explode harmlessly hundreds of yards away. The statistics were old and depressing. In 1942, it took the U.S. Navy an average of nearly 3,000 heavy-caliber shells just to bring down one single airplane. That was not combat that was trying to fill the ocean with steel. But today, the orders are different. The gun captain screams a command. Do not set the timers. I repeat, do not set the timers. Load and fire. John glances at the shell. It does not have the usual metal tip. Instead, it is capped with a strange, dark green nose cone that looks like molded plastic. There are no dials, no numbers. He does not know what is inside, only that it is classified top secret, a clearance level reserved for things that change the physics of war. The Zero opens fire, tracers tearing up the water. John stomps on the firing pedal. The 5-inch gun recoils violently, sending that green-tipped shell screaming into the sky at twice the speed of sound. And then, something happens that violates every rule of warfare the Japanese pilot has ever known. The shell does not hit the plane. It does not even explode at a preset time. It screams past the Zero, missing by a good 20 meters. By all rights, it should be another wasted shot. But as it passes the fighter, the shell wakes up. It senses the presence of the metal beast nearby. Without a millisecond of hesitation, it detonates. This is not a normal explosion, it is a calculated execution. A massive 4-inch fireball erupts, sending thousands of pre-fragmented steel shards tearing through the air at supersonic speeds. The frail aluminum skin of the Zero is instantly turned into a sieve. The wings are sheared off as if by a giant, invisible hand. The fuel tanks rupture, and before the pilot can even comprehend that he has not been hit directly, his aircraft disintegrates. Into a twisting ball of flame and debris, John is stunned. The crew is stunned. They did not have to calculate the lead perfectly. They did not have to guess the timing. They just had to get close. The shells were alive. This was the debut of the VT Fuze. The variable time fuse, or more accurately, the proximity fuse. On that day, the concept of aerial evasion became obsolete. But the true story of this massacre is not about the sailors, it is about a violent marriage between American industrial might and fragile science. To understand why this green nose cone made German and Japanese engineers want to put a bullet in their own heads, we have to look inside that shell at a piece of engineering that was theoretically impossible. The heart of this weapon was a glass light bulb. Yes, a vacuum tube. In the 1940s, before transistors or microchips, the only way to process electronic signals was with vacuum tubes. Delicate glass bulbs containing fragile filaments and grids. You know the type. If you dropped an old radio, the tubes would shatter. Now, imagine the insanity of the engineering challenge. The U.S. Navy asked scientists to take this glass bulb, which breaks if you look at it wrong. and stuff it inside a high-explosive artillery shell. Then, they were going to shoot it out of a cannon. When the trigger is pulled, that shell accelerates from 0 to 2,500 feet per second instantly. The internal components are subjected to 20,000 gs of force, 20,000. That means if you put a smartphone inside that shell, in the split second of firing, it would weigh for tons. It would be crushed into a paste against the back of the casing. And it gets worse. To stay stable, the shell spins at 30,000 revolutions per minute. The centrifugal force alone should rip any electronic component apart, liquefying the insides like a human in a blender. Under these hellish conditions, that glass tube not only has to not break, it has to function perfectly. It has to boot up instantly, transmit a continuous radio wave. Listen for the reflection of that wave bouncing off an enemy plane moving at high speed. Distinguish that signal from the ocean waves or clouds, and then trigger a detonator all in a fraction of a second. When this concept was first proposed, German engineers at Rheinmetall, the absolute peak of precision engineering, looked at the math and gave up. They knew the theory. They had the blueprints for radio fuses, but they calculated the G-forces and concluded that, under the laws of physics, it was impossible to build a vacuum tube that could survive a cannon shot. They were rational. They were logical. And that is why they lost. The Americans, specifically a group of scientific renegades at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, led by a man named Merle Tuve, did not care about the laws of physics. Tuve's philosophy was simple and brutal. I do not want it perfect, I just want it to explode. They did not try to build a masterpiece, they tried to build a brick. They suspended the glass tubes in waxed plastic to absorb the shock. They tested them by dropping them off the roof onto concrete. If they broke, they swept up the glass, changed the design, and dropped them again. They built custom air guns to shoot the components at steel plates. It was crude. It was ugly. It was the antithesis of German craftsmanship, but it worked. They solved the battery problem with a stroke of genius. A liquid battery that was inert until fired. The shock of the gunshot shattered a glass ampule inside, and the spinning of the shell spread the electrolyte over the plates, waking the battery up. The shell was dead on the shelf, but became a living radar station the moment it left the barrel. Did they work perfectly? No. The failure rate was high. Early on, nearly half of them were duds. To a German engineer, a 50% failure rate is a disgrace. To the American industrial machine, it was just a production quota. If half of them fail, we will simply build double the amount. And that is the true horror that the Axis powers faced. It was not just the invention, it was the scale. The American government mobilized the entire electronics industry, RCA, Sylvania, Kodak, General Electric. Companies that made radios and light bulbs switched overnight to making secret weapons. Nearly 100,000 workers, mostly women, sat at assembly lines winding coils of wire thinner than a human hair. Under microscopes, they did not know what they were building. They were told it was for a new type of radio. But by 1944, the United States was churning out 40,000 of these high-tech fuses every single day. By the end of the war, they had produced 22 million of them. Think about that number. While Germany was hand-polishing the gears on a mechanical timer, America was sprinkling 22 million disposable radar stations across the sky like confetti. Each fuse cost the equivalent of 4,000 modern dollars. It was an astronomical waste of money. And the Americans did not care. The strategy was simple: trade expensive industrial garbage for the lives of enemy pilots. But the terrifying potential of the VT Fuze was not fully unleashed until the winter of 1944. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. For years, the Allies had banned the use of VT Fuses on land. They were terrified that a dud would land in German territory, be recovered, and reverse-engineered. If the Luftwaffe got this technology, they could wipe out the Allied bomber fleets. But with General Patton's troops been down, and the weather-grounding air support, General Eisenhower made the call take the leash off. German infantrymen were huddled in their foxholes and trenches, feeling relatively safe. They knew how artillery worked. If a shell hits the ground, the dirt absorbs most of the shrapnel. If you stay low, you live. Then, the American artillery opened up. But the ground did not shake. Instead, the sky or open. The VT Fuses sensed the ground approaching and detonated the shells exactly 10 meters above the treetops. This is called an airburst. The shells did not dig craters. They rained red hot steel vertically downward. The tall pine trees of the Ardennes were shattered, turning into millions of jagged wooden spears that mixed with the shrapnel for the German soldiers in their open-topped foxholes. There was no cover. The earth was no longer a shield. The death was coming from above, precise and inescapable. The psychological impact was devastating. German lines collapsed. One captured officer, trembling and pale, told his interrogator, "It seemed as if your artillery knew exactly where we were. The shells exploded in our faces every time. This is not war, it is slaughter." Across the Channel, the British were using the same technology to save London. The Nazis were launching V1 flying bombs, the first cruise missiles at England. They were too fast for fighters and too small for normal gunnery. But once the anti-aircraft batteries on the coast were equipped with proximity fuses, the equation flipped. In the final weeks of the V1 campaign, Allied gunners were shooting down 79% of the missiles on a single day. Out of 104 flying bombs launched, 68 were destroyed by the invisible radar hand of the VT Fuze. Historians often list the three technologies that won the Second World War: the atomic bomb, radar, and the VT Fuze. The bomb ended the war, radar let us see the enemy, but the VT Fuze was the workhorse that bled the Axis dry. Tactical engagement by tactical engagement. The story of the proximity fuse is the ultimate lesson in the nature of that war. It was not won by superior Aryan super weapons. It was won by the good enough philosophy of mass production. Germany strove for the perfect artifact. America settled for a 50% failure rate, but built 22 million units. The Germans respected the laws of physics. The Americans bullied the laws of physics into submission with wax, plastic, and brute force. Buried in the mud of the Ardennes and resting on the floor of the Pacific Ocean are the remnants of a conflict between two philosophies. The Axis was crushed not just by bravery, but by a glass light bulb that could withstand 20,000 GS, manufactured by a housewife in Ohio, and fired without a second thought. It was a victory of industrial violence delivered by a disposable circuit that did not know mercy, did not know fear, and never, ever missed. If you want more declassified stories of how engineering turned the tide of war, destroy that like button and subscribe for more. I am your tactical archivist. I will see you in the next chapter.